I've been married a year now, and for my 1-year wedding anniversary, I wanted to make my wife something special. 1-year wedding anniversaries are traditionally paper, so I made a paper-themed pendant necklace, and I'm going to show you how I did it. I printed out our wedding vows as small as I could on both sides of a piece of paper. I printed 4 copies just in case, but I really only needed 2. Then I cut a spiral in 1 copy. I took a pair of forceps, grabbed the spiral at the end in the middle of the spiral, and carefully twisted the paper around the forceps tightly. Then I removed the forceps and ended up with a tightly wound strip of paper. To form this into a flower shape, I let the paper unwind a little and worked the top edges of the paper to round them over to look like petals. It's kind of hard to explain. I just worked the paper with my fingers, unwinding, rounding, and flattening a little. I ended up with something that resembles a rose. I used another copy of our vows to cut a stem and single leaf to commemorate 1 year of marriage. I used some super glue to glue the stem to the back of the flower head. I used Mod Podge to seal the paper to prevent blotchy stains from appearing when I embed the paper in casting resin. I ended up putting on about 4 coats, making sure to seal the edges well too. I drilled a 3/4 inch hole in a 1/4 inch piece of oak. Oak has some sentimental value to my wife. I used a Forstner bit, and to prevent tear out, I drilled almost all the way through on one side, then flipped the board over and finished from the other side. This worked pretty well. I then cut the board into a square, roughly, I just eyeballed it. I used the remaining part of the board as a temporary backing piece and put several pieces of packing tape on top. Casting resin won't stick to packing tape. I used 4 C-clamps to hold the 2 pieces of wood together to form a mold. I used Easy Cast epoxy casting resin. There's a link down in the description. I mixed up a small portion of resin of equal parts of resin and hardener and mixed that for a while. Then poured it into a new cup and mixed some more as per the instructions. I then poured a thin layer of resin into the mold and made it level. I used a heat gun to help pop bubbles, then covered it with a dust cover and let it set for a couple of hours. After that first layer had hardened just a bit, I very carefully placed my flower into the mold. And then mixed up a new batch of resin just like before. Then I carefully poured that into the mold. I used the heat gun again and a toothpick to remove as many bubbles as I could. I did end up with a few bubbles, but you have to look very closely to see them. I think the bubbles came from the wood. It might have been better to seal the edges of the hole with Mod Podge. I covered it again and let it completely harden for 48 hours. It's not a fast process. Once the resin was completely hard, I separated the 2 pieces of wood. I had to use a little bit of force, but they came apart just fine. I made mini sanding blocks from some scrap wood. I cut small strips of sandpaper and glued them to the wood with hot glue. I then used these sanding blocks to very carefully sand off the resin that had gotten onto the wood and to sand the wood smooth. This was a tedious job. I had to be super careful not to sand the epoxy in the middle. I've tried several ways, but I haven't found a way to get the resin completely clear once it's scratched. It's better not to scratch it in the first place. Once it was completely sanded, I used a hole in a piece of wood to trace a circle that was slightly larger than the resin-filled hole. I then cut away some excess wood, but I used a sanding disc attached to my homemade drill lathe to sand the wood down to its final size and shape. Then I drilled a small hole in the wood and used my mini sanding blocks again to sand the sides, round over the edges a bit, and do a final sanding on the top and bottom. I finished the wood with a few coats of shellac. I made a simple necklace from some fancy string and little do-it-yourself jewelry clasps. I used some memory wire to form a triangle where 2 ends of wire come together in the middle of one side. By opening up the triangle, I can put the 2 ends into the hole in the pendant and then use some pliers to close it up again. This particular wire is pretty stiff and didn't want to cooperate, but I managed. Then it was just a matter of sliding the pendant onto the necklace. So here's the finished pendant. I think it turned out pretty nice. My wife seems to like it, and that's what's important. I hope you liked the video though. If you did, give it a thumbs up. You can also subscribe to keep up to date with my newest videos, and you can also follow me on Twitter. Thanks for watching. So here's the pendant. So here's the pendant. No, boy, that's cheesy. Whew.